Out on the steppes of Central Asia, where grass ripples like a green sea and wind carries stories farther than the sound of your voice can, there lived the ancient Mongols, horse-born nomads whose entire lives moved with the seasons. To the outsider, the Mongols may seem uncouth, even barbaric. Yet within their world, among the felted jares and wild gallops across frozen rivers, there was an intricate set of customs, and perhaps none was more baffling or biologically curious than the ancient Mongol method of washing hair. You may be surprised to learn that cleanliness, though unconventional by modern standards, held profound significance in Mongol society. While soap, as we know, it wasn't part of their daily kit, and water was often more valuable for drinking than bathing, the Mongols devised other means to stay clean. One such method involved an unlikely liquid, horse urine. To understand why anyone might pour fermented horse urine over their scalp, we must first understand how the Mongols lived, and more importantly, what they lived around. At the heart of Mongol life was the horse. A Mongol without a horse was a fish without water. Horses provided transport, meat, milk, and companionship. Their dung fueled fires. Their blood could be drunk in emergencies. So when one looked around and saw hundreds of horses relieving themselves daily on the plains, the idea of waste was different. Everything had a use, even urine. But it wasn't just any horse urine. The Mongols knew that fresh urine was acidic and pungent, often too strong to apply directly. Instead, they preferred aged horse urine, stored for days or even weeks in leather containers, until it became milder in scent and gained cleaning potency due to the buildup of ammonia. When poured onto hair, it acted much like an early version of shampoo. The ammonia would strip away oil and dirt, leaving the scalp not only cleaner but oddly invigorated, like a harsh tonic from nature's apothecary. Travelers from Persia and China who encountered the Mongols often wrote about this practice in tones of disbelief. A Persian chronicler, Adam al-Javani, noted that Mongol warriors were unclean in appearance but took strange measures to refresh their heads with sour liquids. The Chinese diplomat Zhao Hong, visiting the Mongols in the 13th century, commented dryly that their manner of bathing differs from the courtly traditions of the Middle Kingdom. To the Mongols, though it was a ritual, hair was considered an extension of the soul. Children were rarely shaved entirely, and adults often plaited their hair into intricate braids. A clean scalp was thought to ward off spirits, sickness, and weakness, and during religious ceremonies, a proper cleansing with fermented urine was seen as a kind of spiritual reset. But this raises a question. How did such a strange habit originate? One theory posits that the practice emerged from observation. When horses urinated in specific spots, especially near salt licks, Mongols noticed that ants, mites, and other insects avoided those areas. The antimicrobial properties of aged urine weren't scientifically known, but they were seen in effect. Over time, using the urine as a topical agent made sense, especially in a culture where bathing with water was impractical for much of the year. It is worth remembering, too, that the Mongols often wore heavy felt hats, padded in winter and adorned with cloth bands in summer. These could trap sweat and oil in the hair, leading to buildup. A rinse with ammonia-rich fluid might not have been pleasant, but it helped reset the scalp. Think of it as a scalp detox, 13th century style. And they weren't entirely alone in their logic. In ancient Rome, human urine was collected in public jars and sold as a cleaning agent for togas and teeth. Yes, Roman laundries prized the ammonia in urine to whiten garments. And Roman barbers? They recommended it to clients with discolored teeth. So while the Mongols' version may sound rural and rustic, they shared company with the so-called civilized empires. Still, there's an important difference. The Romans used human urine. The Mongols preferred horse urine, cleaner, less disease-prone, and abundant. If you're wondering how this smelled, you're not alone. Historical documents mention a strong, sour hay odor that followed many Mongol warriors. Yet, when traveling in large numbers, such a scent became normalized, like campfire smoke or cured leather. Some even described it as comforting, a sign that your tribe, your kin, were close by. Interestingly, fermented urine wasn't used just for the hair. Some warriors applied it to their clothing or rubbed it into boots to soften hardened leather. In battle, wounds were sometimes washed with diluted horse urine when no clean water was available. Again, the ammonia, while painful, likely helped reduce infections in an age without antiseptics. By now, you may be asking, why does this matter? Why tell the story of a people washing their heads with what we might discard? Because embedded in this practice is a deeper truth about the Mongols. They were a people who wasted nothing, who adapted to extreme environments with creativity, to survive on the steppes, an unforgiving, wind-scoured expanse where trees were rare and winters killed the unprepared. You had to make use of every living thing, even its waste. And beyond the peculiarity, there is humility here. The Mongols weren't too proud to use what nature provided. Their legacy isn't in golden palaces or sculpted baths, but in resilience. They created the largest contiguous land empire in human history, on horseback under yurts, cleaning their hair with horse pee. But of course, this wasn't the only unusual grooming ritual they practiced. In fact, their methods for shaving, braiding, and oiling hair might surprise you even more and hint at a deep cultural reverence for the body that went beyond function. If the Mongols were a people of motion, then hair was the map they carried on their bodies. It's tempting to imagine Genghis Khan's warriors as wild, wind-blown barbarians with unkempt manes flying behind them as they galloped across the steppes. But such a picture misses the deliberate care Mongols gave to grooming, a care rooted not in vanity, but in survival, spirituality, and social identity. Let's begin with the braid. To braid hair was to order chaos. Every Mongol man, woman, or child maintained braids of some kind. Young girls often wore twin plaits behind their ears, while boys had locks knotted in the center of their scalps. Warriors usually styled their hair in thick, rope-like braids, sometimes wrapped around their heads beneath a helmet, other times left to trail down their backs. Why the uniformity? Because in a world where communication was done with smoke signals, galloping messengers, or throat-sung chants, hair was a language. The number and type of braids could indicate a Mongol's tribe, marital status, or rank. A single braid wrapped with a red cord might mean a warrior of noble birth. Twin braids with bone ornaments could mark a widow in mourning. In battle, this helped Mongols identify one another in the chaos. But more subtly, it was a way of binding a people together across the vast silence of the steppe. Before braiding, however, the hair had to be prepared, and this brings us back to the peculiar shampoo we met in section 1. The aged horse urine was often just the beginning of the process. After rinsing, some Mongols would rub their scalps with melted animal fat, usually mutton or horse, to recondition the hair and protect it from windburn and the drying effects of winter. This greasy layer also helped style the hair more easily into firm, long-lasting braids. Think of it as ancient pomade. Over time, the practice of oiling and braiding became ritualized. On the eve of a long journey or major battle, warriors would often cleanse their hair, then gather around a fire where elders or female relatives would braid and bless them. Songs were sung, old victories recalled. Sometimes, a braid was cut and burned as an offering to the spirits of the land, a promise of return or a plea for protection. Facial hair had its own customs. Contrary to what popular depictions might suggest, not all Mongols were bearded. Facial hair varied greatly among different clans and was sometimes discouraged in certain tribal traditions. For instance, many of Genghis Khan's elite guards, the Keshig, were required to keep their faces clean-shaven, partly for uniformity, partly for hygiene beneath helmets, and perhaps also to show disciplined restraint. Shaving tools were rudimentary, thin knives or bronze razors, and the shaving process itself could be a communal activity. In some clans, it was customary for an elder to shave the younger warriors at sunrise on the day of a hunt or raid, symbolically clearing the path for success. Others believed that a clean face reduced one's wind resistance on horseback, which sounds odd until you've ridden for 12 hours into a stiff northern wind. Mongol women, meanwhile, were often meticulous about grooming, not out of compliance but out of command. Women held significant authority in Mongol life, especially when men were away on campaign. Hair care, dress, and personal hygiene became ways of preserving dignity and status during long absences. Married women typically wore elaborate headgear, called boda, decorated with pearls, feathers, or cloth, often with space carved out for their tightly coiled braids. Interestingly, during peacetime, some women and even men used a mild paste made from yak milk and ash to scrub their faces. This acted as a kind of exfoliant, smoothing the skin and reducing sun damage. Once again, these were not cosmetic luxuries, but adaptive techniques in an environment that punished neglect. But what did cleanliness mean in Mongol culture? Unlike Roman or Chinese civilizations, where public baths and aesthetic perfection were idealized, the Mongols viewed hygiene through the lens of functionality and spiritual readiness. To be clean was not to be perfumed or polished, it was to be prepared. A clean head could receive a blessing. A cleaned wound could heal. A properly braided warrior could wear his helmet without discomfort and ride days without distraction. And yet, there was something almost philosophical in their approach. Mongols believed that dirt from the outside was less dangerous than rot from within. Gossip, betrayal, cowardice. These were the true stains. One popular proverb said, "Better to smell of horses than to stink of dishonor." That, perhaps, was the core of their grooming ethos. Visible dirt could be washed away, but moral stains required greater cleansing. Even so, there were standards. Visitors to Karakoram, the Mongol capital during the 13th century, noted that public feasts began with hand and face washing using fermented mare's milk or water infused with herbs. Guests were offered scented cloths, often soaked in lavender or pine resin, to wipe their hands. It may not have been Versailles, but the idea of hospitality required physical care. Beyond the body, the Mongols also cleaned their tools, weapons, and even saddles with makeshift scrubs of wool and ash. Horses were brushed daily. Yurts were aired regularly to avoid sickness, and even if it meant standing in -20 degrees Celsius wind for half an hour, cleanliness was part of a broader practice of readiness. Perhaps the most intriguing ritual came during funerals. When a member of the clan passed away, their closest relatives would often burn their own hair or cut it as a symbol of grief. Afterward, they would wash with urine or herb-infused water, shave parts of their heads, and remain unbraided for a set number of days. In a society where braiding was identity, to unbraid oneself was to say, "I am not whole," which brings us to a curious contradiction. How could a people so often dismissed as barbaric possess such layered, symbolic grooming rituals? Maybe that's the very point. The Mongols didn't separate physical care from cultural meaning. They didn't have ivory combs or scented soaps, but they had stories in their hair, identity in their oils, and memory in the scent of fermented fluids. To wash your hair in horse urine wasn't just about grease. It was about belonging. Still, one wonders, how did these traditions survive the transition from nomadic tents to empire capitals like Karakoram? Did Mongol nobles wash like their ancestors? Or did they begin adopting foreign customs, influenced by the Persians, Chinese, and Russians who now lived within their borders? That is a question for the next section, where we explore how Mongol hygiene evolved as they conquered the world, and what happened when the nomads met cities, trade, and foreign baths. As the Mongol Empire galloped beyond the grassy horizon of its homeland, swallowing cities and civilizations from the Pacific to the Danube, it found itself facing a challenge it could not simply outride: the city. The dust of the steppe gave way to tiled streets. The winds carrying horse sweat and firewood now mixed with the smells of incense, rosewater, sewage, and soap. The world of nomadic grooming collided with the world of bathhouses and silk-robed courtiers, and neither would emerge unchanged. At the height of the empire under Genghis Khan's descendants, Mongols ruled over a dizzying array of cultures: Chinese, Persian, Russian, Korean, Armenian, and Arab. With these cultures came rituals, customs, and daily practices the steppe-born Mongols had never imagined. Public bathhouses, perfumes, cosmetics, scented oils, linen towels, flower-infused soaps. These were standard in the great cities of the Islamic world and the Song dynasty. At first, Mongol leaders were skeptical. Genghis Khan himself had been famously wary of water baths, believing they opened the pores and allowed evil spirits to enter the body. In traditional Mongol belief, washing in standing water, especially rivers, was often considered spiritually dangerous. The great Khan preferred smoke cleansing, oil wiping, and, of course, the occasional fermented horse rinse. But cities change people. As the empire expanded, Mongol khans, generals, and aristocrats began adopting more refined personal care. The Persian historian Javani described how Hulagu Khan, conqueror of Baghdad, had Persian physicians prepare scented tonics and smooth washes for his beard and brows. Chinese sources mention that Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson and founder of the Yuan dynasty in China, had a royal staff dedicated to grooming: barbers, oilers, washers, and even plume masters who dusted his robes with silk fans. It was a long way from felt hats and fermented pea. But the shift wasn't merely indulgence, it was adaptation. As rulers of settled empires, the Mongols needed to govern not just warriors but merchants, scholars, bureaucrats, and emissaries. Hygiene became part of diplomacy. To meet a Persian vizier while smelling like a yak was, well, problematic. Mongol rulers began to embrace scented oils like attar of roses, used extensively in the Middle East. In China, they adopted powdered soaps and herbal rinses made from lotus root and camellia. Interestingly, these luxuries didn't fully replace old practices, they merged. Many nobles kept their childhood habits, such as scalp massage with horse fat or seasonal haircuts based on lunar rituals, but now supplemented them with foreign methods. A Mongol noblewoman might still braid her hair with butter in the winter, but afterward, she'd rinse her hands in imported rose water. A general might allow himself to be bathed in a copper tub, so long as a trusted shaman blessed the water. Still, deep within the empire's rural bones, in the mobile camps far from city palaces, old methods prevailed. Farmers, herders, and low-ranking soldiers continued to use what their ancestors had: aged urine, smoke baths, milk-based cleansers. And these weren't seen as backward. They were seen as Mongol, a way of life, a sign of identity. But what happened after the empire declined? As the vast Mongol domains splintered into smaller khanates, like the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan in China, the cultures they once governed began to seep back into their own. Former Mongols in Persia adopted Persian-style bathhouses. In China, they began to follow Confucian cleanliness rules. By the 15th century, many Mongol-descended nobles were indistinguishable in habit and dress from the locals around them. The horse urine shampoo faded into legend. Yet, in Mongolia itself, some practices persisted. Even today, in the high-steppe regions of Central Asia, rural herders continue to use fermented mare's milk, arag, or plant-based rinses for hair care. Some families preserve ancient grooming songs, rhythmic chants sung while braiding a child's hair. A few elders remember their grandparents using astringent horse urine in emergencies, when water was scarce or illness spread. And perhaps this is where the story becomes more than odd history, because behind the fermented rinses and braided rituals is a question as old as civilization. How do we stay ourselves while adapting to the world around us? The Mongols remind us that even amid conquest and change, hygiene was a form of identity. When they ruled half the known world, they didn't immediately trade their habits for foreign luxuries. They integrated. They kept the smell of the steppe even while riding through marble cities. And for all its oddity, the idea of using what's available, what the land gives, is something we still wrestle with today. Modern hair care is often about ingredients, marketing, and brand identity. But strip it all back, and it's still the same act. To clean, to care, to prepare for the world. So, the next time you run your fingers through clean hair or pour shampoo into your palm, take a moment. Think of the steppe. Think of a bronze bowl of aged horse urine, thick with ammonia, steaming in the morning sun. Think of a warrior readying for battle, not with weapons, but with a braid. Because even history's fiercest riders needed a moment to wash their hair. In the marbled halls of ancient Rome, where orators thundered and togas rustled like sails in the wind, great matters of state were discussed. War, law, conquest, citizenship. But on more than one occasion, in the solemn Senate itself, the debates drifted towards something far less dignified, the preparation of dormice. To the modern ear, this sounds absurd. Imagine today's politicians arguing over how best to saute a squirrel. And yet, in ancient Rome, these small, pudgy rodents, gliss, to use their Latin name, were more than food. They were status. They were spectacle. And how one ate a dormouse said almost as much about you as how you voted on taxes or declared allegiance in a civil war. To understand this strange obsession, we must first understand the dormouse itself. Native to Europe, this shy, nocturnal creature hibernated for much of the year, emerging in warm seasons to fatten itself on nuts, berries, and fruit. This made it perfect prey not just for predators but for ambitious Roman chefs. By the time of the late Republic and early Empire, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, dormice were no longer wild-caught, they were farmed. Roman aristocrats built special terracotta jars called gleraria, small, lidded chambers with ventilation holes and little ramps inside. These jars served as portable dormouse farms. Kept in the dark and fed barley, walnuts, and chestnuts, the animals grew fat and sleepy, ideal for plucking and roasting at a moment's notice. But here's where things got complicated. In the homes of Rome's elite, dormice were more than appetizers. They were culinary theater. Cooked with honey and poppy seeds, stuffed with pork or herbs, or rolled in oats and roasted whole, they became a test of sophistication and wealth. To serve dormice at your banquet was a flex. To not serve them, a social misstep. And so, the question arose, what was the proper way to serve them? Senators argued whether the dormouse should be deskinned or served whole with fur removed. Should it be stuffed with spiced sausage or left pure, simply roasted on a spit? Should it be paired with strong wine or a gentle Falernian vintage? These debates weren't idle, they were deeply tied to politics. In Rome, indulgence and excess were both admired and condemned. One senator's elaborate dormouse dish might be praised as a symbol of refinement, while another's could be mocked as decadence. The philosopher Seneca, writing in a letter to a friend, once scolded the habit of raising small beasts for the singular pleasure of overstuffing one's own gut. And Cato the Elder, Rome's grumpy moralist-in-chief, called dormice eating a sign that the empire had grown too fond of its comforts. But others disagreed. To them, dormice symbolized Rome's superiority. A land so wealthy it could afford to breed delicacies in jars. Banquets became battlefields of social class. If your dormouse was undercooked or poorly spiced, you might find yourself excluded from the next dinner party. If your preparation was inventive enough, say, slow roasted with garum, fermented fish sauce, and pomegranate, you might be the talk of the Palatine Hill. Writers like Petronius and Martial teased the practice in poetry and satire. Petronius's Satyricon features a scene in which dormice are served as the opening dish of a lavish feast, dusted in cinnamon and coated in honey. A ridiculous indulgence meant to show just how far Roman tastes had drifted from the rustic virtues of their ancestors. Yet the obsession ran deeper still. In some villas, especially in the countryside of Campania, dormice were bred like lapdogs. Children named them. Guests were allowed to choose one from a glirarium and observe its preparation as part of the entertainment. The animal's death became performance art. Some slaves even specialized in dormouse presentation, carving the tiny creatures tableside with delicate bronze knives. But this rising trend triggered a backlash. As Rome expanded, bringing in new provinces and peoples, traditionalists feared the dilution of Roman virtue. To them, fussing over the correct seasoning for a rodent was a symptom of imperial rot. Cicero himself, in a now-lost speech known only by a surviving quote, allegedly mocked an opponent by saying, "He brings more thought to his gloraria than to the Republic." The Senate, ever the mirror of Rome's contradictions, found itself entangled in these debates, not because dormice mattered so much, but because they symbolized the struggle between austere past and indulgent present. Do we eat dormice to celebrate our greatness? Or does our obsession with them prove our decay? And this wasn't an isolated case. Roman history is filled with such strange food-based anxieties. But few foods inspired as much mockery, admiration, and symbolic meaning as the humble dormouse. Still, despite the controversy, the dormouse remained a staple, at least for a while. What led to its eventual fall from culinary grace? Why did the glirarium disappear from Roman villas by the late Empire? That is the question we turn to in the next section, when the dormouse, once a symbol of aristocratic pride, fell victim to a changing empire and a hungry taxman. By the time Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the dormouse, once merely a cute rodent hiding in the hedgerows, had become an object of national fascination, culinary prestige, and cultural tension. But as with many things in the Roman world, its symbolic weight eventually became too heavy to carry. The dormouse's fall from grace wasn't dramatic. It didn't vanish in a single edict or scandal, but it was noticeable. One by one, the tiny rodent farms in the villas of the wealthy went quiet. The gloraria, those carefully crafted dormouse jars, cracked and crumbled into storage sheds, and the once sophisticated recipes faded from the tongues of poets and chefs alike. So what happened? To begin, Rome changed, not just in politics but in appetite. As the empire expanded into Egypt, Gaul, Britain, and beyond, so too did its access to new delicacies. Flamingo tongues from North Africa, honey-roasted peacock brains from Thrace, oyster farms in Baiae. Roman cuisine, always experimental, grew increasingly global, and dormice began to feel quaint. For the newly rich elites of the empire, Bred not in the Senate halls of Rome but in the bureaucracies of Antioch, Alexandria, and Ephesus, dormice felt provincial, even boring. Who would waste their table on a chubby rat when they could serve parrotfish boiled in wine? Secondly, the symbolic power of the dormouse began to curdle. As we saw in Section 1, dormice had become lightning rods for debates about excess. They were cheap symbols for the moral decay that critics saw in the imperial system. Writers like Juvenal and Pliny the Elder began to tie dormouse cuisine to laziness, gluttony, and moral weakness. One satirical verse accused a senator of gorging rodents while Rome starves for bread. It didn't matter if the claim was true, it stuck. In fact, by the reign of Emperor Tiberius, whispers had begun that the glirarium should be taxed or even banned. Though no direct law survives, fragments from agricultural texts suggest restrictions on breeding dormice for sale. It's even been suggested that Tiberius himself considered regulating the practice, not for ethics, but because raising dormice was becoming too profitable for villa owners, diverting labor from grain and wine production, which were essential to the empire's food supply and military logistics. And then came the taxmen. As the Roman Empire ballooned in size and complexity, so too did its bureaucratic appetite. Imperial tax collectors, tasked with extracting resources from every corner of the empire, began targeting luxury food markets. Fish sauce sellers, spice merchants, exotic animal breeders, and yes, dormouse farmers. Glirarium operators, once proud artisans of taste, were now scrutinized as potential tax cheats. A report found in the Vindolanda tablets, a series of preserved wooden records from a Roman fort in Britain, mentions a complaint about a merchant undervaluing fattened mice to avoid customs, suggesting that even on the frontiers, dormice were a taxable and therefore regulated commodity. The result? Fewer breeders, more expensive rodents. A dish that was once commonplace at upper-class dinners became a rare and fading novelty. But there was another, subtler shift. The Roman palate was maturing, or at least becoming more sensitive to ideas of refined rusticity. Influenced by Greek philosophies, especially Stoicism and Epicureanism, a wave of Roman elites began to shun opulence in favor of simple virtue. Cicero's dream of the humble countryside man returned to fashion. Lavish dormouse feasts were seen as tacky. A senator who once hosted elaborate rodent tastings might now boast of living off barley porridge and figs, even if his mansion still boasted imported marble floors. In other words, dormice became a gauche relic of the past, a joke with a bitter aftertaste. They had once stood for wealth, cleverness, and taste. Now they signaled someone clinging too tightly to old, overstuffed ways. And so, by the 3rd century CE, dormice had mostly vanished from the Roman table. They weren't extinct. Some country households still raised them. They were occasionally mentioned in texts, once even ridiculed by the Christian apologist Tertullian, who condemned their breeding as flesh prepared for idol gods and worse men. But their golden era was over. The gliraria were stacked in corners, forgotten. A few collectors of ancient objects, especially in the eastern provinces, preserved them out of curiosity. One was found centuries later, buried in a villa's kitchen garden in Pompeii, with tiny tooth marks still inside. Archaeologists now admire these jars for their ingenuity, with spiraled interiors to mimic tree trunks and little feeding slots for nuts and dried fruit. Ingenious technology for something so tiny. So what, then, became of the dormouse as a symbol? In some ways, it became a lesson. For historians, it marks how food reflects power, and how power shifts faster than taste. In other ways, it endured as satire. Roman comedies from the late Empire often used the dormouse as a punchline. A bumbling noble might trip over his own glirarium, spilling rodents across the floor. Even centuries later, in medieval manuscripts, Roman decadence is often caricatured with platters of roasted dormice, served by devils to sinners in hell. But perhaps what's most fascinating is how this tiny creature, bred in clay pots, roasted with honey, and eaten with silver picks, stirred arguments in the world's most powerful political chamber. And yet, one final question remains. How do we know the dormice were actually delicious? Were they truly worth the fuss, or simply symbols too juicy to resist? That's a question we'll turn to next, when we examine Roman taste buds more closely, and how the flavors of empire, rot, and sweetness shaped what Romans believed was good. In the late autumn twilight, the yurts of the Orkhon Valley shimmered like scattered stars. The air had thinned with winter's approach, and the wind carried with it the mingled scent of scorched dung fires, fermented mare's milk, and the faint ammoniac ghost of horse urine drying on wool. As the Mongol Empire reached its apex, its systems, both majestic and mundane, took shape in quiet precision. And among those peculiar yet profoundly adapted rituals was one that had grown from practicality into tradition: the recycling of horse urine for personal hygiene. By now, the fermented solution, known in some chronicles as archikarhak, was as common in the nomads' satchels as dried meat or tallow cakes. Warriors rubbed it into their scalps with slow, circular motions, a habit that came to signify not just cleanliness, but discipline and strength. Elder women like Borte, known across 4 clans for her silver braid and calloused hands, led seasonal demonstrations for girls transitioning into adulthood: how to distill, mix with goat fat, and apply the potion without overburning the scalp. A Chinese envoy, in his 1320 travel diary, described his experience with this harsh water of warriors. He was gifted a flask of it upon departing Karakoram and, mistaking it for a tonic, had taken a sip. "My tongue burned for 3 days," he wrote. "And yet I was told this is what gives them hair like ropes of silk and faces clean as milk stone." The shampoo, if it could be called that, had evolved. Clay urns now held the liquid for weeks before use. Sometimes herbs were added: sage, juniper, or even dried chrysanthemum from the Yuan court. The nomads did not call it luxury. It was survival with elegance. For in a world where water could not always be spared for a rinse, and where lice could undo armies more quickly than swords, ammonia did what soap could not. But deeper than the function was the symbolism. For the Mongols, the horse was not merely transportation. It was an extension of the body, an altar of breath and speed. Using its waste was a way of honoring its totality. Nothing was discarded. Even in the ceremonial blessing of horses during Naadam festivals, the women who washed the manes and brushed the tails often did so using the same cleanser, distilled from months-old stores. The smell was sharp, like scorched grass and vinegar, but to them it was the scent of strength. There are even records from Persian chroniclers, witnesses to the thunder of hooves that swept through Khorasan, who noted the odd shine of Mongol hair. Neither oiled nor powdered, wrote Rashid al-Din. Yet the soldiers of Temujin gleam as if kissed by stars. He never knew that what he saw was fermented urea, massaged over weeks, lifted by wind, and sealed into braids with ash. But like all rituals rooted in necessity, time would move it into memory. As the empire fragmented and sons of Genghis scattered into kingdoms, the need for such methods dwindled. In cities, soap arrived. Baths grew more frequent. Horse urine ceased to be sacred and returned to being waste. And slowly, the scent of ammonia vanished from hair and cloth, replaced by the imported oils of Samarkand and Baghdad. But in a few remote jars deep in the Altai, older women still kept the recipe in memory. Not because they needed it, but because it reminded them of a time when the earth was wide, the wind obedient, and every part of life, from saddle to scalp, was sustained by the wisdom of the animal they rode into eternity. And so the story of Mongol Shampoo ends not in ridicule, but in reverence. Because in history, the line between disgusting and ingenious is often drawn by the comforts we've come to expect. And in the hands of a people who conquered half the world from horseback, even horse pee was alchemy. Sleep now and dream not just of khans and conquests, but of the quiet rituals that made survival not only possible, but beautiful. The final moments of the Gong farmer's day arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet kind of triumph that few would ever recognize. He never expected applause, not from the nobles whose velvet-lined robes trailed across polished halls above him, not from the stable boys who wrinkled their noses when he passed, not even from the cooks who knew the scent of waste meant the chamber pots were emptied, and the kitchens could function in peace again. No, his world was applause-free, but it was also strangely peaceful. The candle that had lit his last chamber began to burn lower, the wax curling inward like a protective hand. With the final chamber scraped and the waste carefully carted out into the barrels awaiting him in the courtyard, Tom pushed the last wheelbarrow through the narrow passage, its creaky wheel groaning beneath the weight of human history. Outside, the cool breath of night swept across his face. The stench, ever present, hung about him like a damp cloak. But to Tom, this was not filth. It was proof of a job completed, of a world running silently because someone bore the burden of what others left behind. He paused for a moment in the moonlight. Above, the castle's towers reached for the sky, stately and majestic. Inside, people prepared for sleep, unaware, or perhaps willfully forgetful, that the luxury of cleanliness came with a price, that their silks and spices were matched in value by the unseen labor of the lowliest trades. Tom lit a second torch and headed down the sloped trail toward the dumping field. He could still remember when he first discovered this place. Hidden just beyond the edge of the castle's reach, where farmers refused to till and where even the rats hesitated. It was here that he had carefully layered years' worth of refuse, turning it, mixing it, letting nature slowly alchemize filth into fertility. It was here, too, that the cycle completed itself. It is easy to romanticize the past. Kings in velvet, knights in shining armor, maidens weaving by candlelight. But what is often forgotten is that every drop of honeyed wine, every polished boot, and every royal banquet left behind a trail of human waste that someone had to carry. By hand, by back, by barrow. Cleanliness in the medieval world was a paradox. Public streets ran with refuse, but nobles demanded lavender-scented linens. Town squares rang with music, but alleyways reeked of unwashed humanity. In this world, the gong farmer was both reviled and essential. Without him, the castle's very foundations would rot. Disease would spread, rebellion might fester. The prestige of the highborn would collapse under the weight of their own waste. And so he carried on year after year, cleansing a society that would never cleanse him. By the time Tom reached the dump site, the stars were high and brilliant above him. He pulled open the wooden slats of the compost trough and began the final act of his nightly ritual. With practiced arms, he shoveled the contents of his cart into the pile, careful not to spill, careful always to spread and bury the newer loads among the older, darker, richer matter. The earthworms were already awake. He could see them twitching, wriggling through the dark as they broke down the excrement into something resembling soil. Once, a monk who studied the healing arts had told him, "Your work is holy, whether you see it or not." Tom had laughed then, so loudly that he'd startled the donkey he used to push barrels. But in the years since, the monk's words had stayed with him. Wasn't it strange? In a world obsessed with purity and prestige, the one who handled the dirtiest work made it possible for gardens to bloom, for herbs to be grown, for sickness to be held at bay. He was no priest, no scholar, but he was a part of a cycle as ancient as the moon that hung above him. The cycle of waste into life, of endings into beginnings. There came a winter when Tom's joints ached more than usual. His fingers, once thick and strong, began to tremble. The wheelbarrow seemed heavier, the passageways narrower, the stairs to the upper privies more treacherous. And so he did what few gong farmers before him had ever done. He trained someone to take his place. Young Merritt was no fool. The boy was wiry, quiet, and observant. He listened more than he spoke, a good trait for someone who would need to learn the castle's waste system like a second language. Tom taught him everything. How to judge the weight of a full bucket, how to brace your knees when hauling a load down slick stone steps, how to recognize the smell of infected waste, a sign of plague or worse, and how to use ashes and lime to cleanse a chamber without water. And, when the time came, Tom handed over the keys to the waste cellar and left quietly. He didn't ask for a pension. He didn't leave a letter. He simply walked through the same servant's gate he had used for decades and returned to the small plot of land he'd once bought with his gong farming wages. Cheap land, given how foul it had once been. But now, now the soil was black as pitch and rich as anything he'd seen. Tomatoes bloomed in July. Carrots came up sweet in September. A row of cabbages the size of water pails sprouted by the wall where he buried the oldest compost. And no one ever asked how it grew so well. So next time you think of castles and kings, take a moment to wonder, Who kept the toilets from overflowing? Who carried the weight of society's waste while others dined by candlelight? The answer lies beneath your feet, and perhaps, just perhaps, the quiet dignity of those who worked in the dark is more noble than all the crowns in Christendom. Now close your eyes, dear listener. The torch has gone out. The bucket is empty. The castle sleeps. And somewhere beneath its stone bones, the last gong farmer walks home under stars, leaving behind only silence and a job well done. The fire crackled in low tones in a smoky longhouse, the kind of night when the wind outside sang with Norse gods' forgotten sighs. Inside, men and women sat cross-legged, the air thick with ale, wood smoke, and the stories of raiders, healers, and shipwrights. Among them sat old Eirik, whose smile glinted strangely when he laughed, not with gold, but with tiny grooves carved into his front teeth. No one noticed them in the flickering firelight, but if you leaned close, as the curious sometimes did, you'd see the notches. Slender, shallow lines etched horizontally across the enamel, some blackened with soot, others filled with red ochre or crushed garnet. Not decorative in the way of necklaces or rings. No, these were messages, like runes across the mouth, teeth that whispered. Archaeologists in the late 20th century unearthed the bones of Norsemen buried deep in Swedish and Danish soils. Their teeth, intact and grinning from the grave, bore similar carvings. Most common among warriors, these strange dental decorations puzzled modern scholars. Was it ornamentation, tribal identity, a ritual of passage before a raid, or something more peculiar, like the strange way warriors in Central Africa sharpened their teeth to points, or the intricate dental inlays of the Maya, who pressed jade into molars as if their mouths were temples. Some historians suggested the Vikings, particularly those who traveled far and wide, across the rivers of Rus, down to the sands of Al-Andalus, even to Constantinople, might have borrowed the practice from those they traded or battled. In Viking burials from the 10th and 11th centuries unearthed in Irland and Skane, several male skeletons, estimated to be between 25 and 45 years old at death, showed grooves in their front teeth, cut with surprising precision. The work was delicate. There were no steel drills, no anesthetic, and yet these grooves were symmetrical, horizontal lines, spaced evenly, and sometimes rubbed with dark materials to make them stand out. The tools were likely small flint blades, obsidian edges, or sharpened bone. No signs of infection, no evidence of pain in the remains. Just calmly altered enamel, modified with eerie care. But why? Why would a Viking, who wore chainmail to war and swore oaths beneath Yggdrasil, allow someone to carve into his very teeth? Some believe it was intimidation. Imagine the moment. A Viking leaps from his longship, axe in hand, blood already on his beard. The enemy freezes, not at his weapon, but his teeth. His scream reveals streaks of red and black, etched lines that seem unnatural, otherworldly, as though the gods themselves had marked him. Others suggest it was ritualistic. Perhaps before their first raid, boys were marked. Perhaps, like a tattoo or scarification, it was meant to signify a life already given to Odin, already crossed beyond fear. And then, a softer theory. that it was beauty. In a world where hair was combed, beards oiled, cloaks dyed with imported madder root, perhaps the tooth grooves were an extension of fashion. We often forget that Vikings weren't just brutes. They were artisans, poets, farmers, and lovers. A carved tooth, filled with red pigment, might have been the Viking version of a smile with a gemstone. We do not know. The sagas are silent. No skald thought to write. And lo, he brushed his teeth and filed them thus. We are left with bones and guesses. Yet the silence speaks too, because the carvings stopped. By the late 1100s, such modifications disappear from the record. Christianity spread, and with it, new ideas about the body, sin, and the sacredness of suffering. The Viking world, once carved with stories and bone-deep meanings, became quiet, first in the churches, then in the mouths. Still, somewhere in a museum drawer in Stockholm or beneath a mound of mossy earth, a warrior's tooth waits, lined and etched, telling a story no one quite remembers. There is something oddly tender about the way a Viking would prepare for war. It wasn't all roars and iron. There was ritual, polish, and strangely enough, a mirror. Yes, a mirror. Because in the glint of polished bronze, warriors didn't just see their face. They saw their legend being carved, tooth by tooth. In the early centuries of Norse expansion, from the 8th to the 11th century, raiders were not merely brutes with beards. They were artisans of fear. Their weapons, etched, inlaid, and burnished, weren't the only tools of intimidation. Their mouths were sharpened too, and not with words. When archaeologists unearthed a grave in Birka, Sweden in the late 1990s, they found a man laid out like a fallen bear god. His bones were coiled with respect. His axe still whispered rage. But what caught their eyes was not the usual weaponry or armor. It was his smile, or rather what remained of it. Etched into his front teeth were horizontal grooves filled with dark pigment, likely coal, crushed hematite, or possibly resin mixed with iron oxide. The grooves were too symmetrical, too precise to be natural. They had been filed and filled deliberately. Why? Some speculate these were war markings, designed to flash intimidation in the flicker of torchlight. Imagine this. You're a monk in Lindisfarne, the fog still curling around your ankles, when a dragon-headed longship splits the water. You brace for the worst, but nothing prepares you for the man who charges at you with blood-red eyes and gleaming, painted teeth. Others believe it was a social signal, an ancient badge of badassery. Like tattoos today or piercings in punk culture, these dental modifications separated the battle-scarred from the greenhorns. You didn't just earn those lines. You bled for them. Some even whisper that the pigments may have had mild narcotic effects, allowing warriors to go numb or ecstatic as they fought. Whether that's true or not, no one really knows. Viking records were mostly oral, and the mouths that told those tales were buried long ago. But here's what we do know. These men cared about how they looked when they died. Death was not an end to them. It was a doorway. The Hall of Valhalla had no room for dullness. You had to look the part. If your sword had sung, your smile had to echo. And so began the art of Viking dental design. In graves across Sweden, Denmark, and even some parts of England, signs of similar modifications have appeared. Horizontal striations, pigmented grooves, some even chipped into tiny V-shapes, mimicking the runes of their gods. It was not widespread. Perhaps only elite warriors or berserkers were granted the right. But it existed, quietly, persistently. There's a theory, half-whispered by historians and half-laughed off by dentists, that Viking tooth grooves also served a functional purpose. Perhaps they allowed warriors to carry herbal paste or pungent stimulants into battle, biting down for a jolt of clarity in the blur of war. Imagine Red Bull Viking Edition. But even if that's fantasy, it still speaks to something real. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were deeply theatrical. Psychological warfare was part of their campaign. To look like a demon was to win before a blade was drawn. Now consider this. These grooves required someone to make them. Carefully, painfully. There must have been artisans, dentists, if you will, among the Norse. Men or women who held the head still, rubbed herbs to dull the pain, then filed enamel into legend. What tools did they use? Flint? Bronze? Whalebone picks? And what songs did they hum to distract from the scraping? Perhaps it happened at night under torchlight, or at dawn just before a voyage. A rite of passage, a sacrifice of comfort for eternal presence. To carry metal in your mouth was to say, I do not fear pain, I carry it with pride. And there's something beautiful about that in a rugged kind of way. To imagine the moment a Viking warrior submitted to the ritual of tooth carving, we must step inside a small, smoky longhouse, one lit by the crackling of pine pitch and the hush of a drum, beating low like a heart made of hide. The tools were nothing like the glinting precision of modern clinics. Instead, they were born of bone, flint, and fire, thin slivers of sharpened stone, honed until they could etch a groove as fine as thread. Pieces of iron heated over coals until they hissed and smoked when cooled in snow. They did not have dentists, they had bone workers, metal whisperers, and pain bearers. Some believe that the ritual was done by the same hands that carved runes into wood or stone. Artists, in a brutal sense, people who understood symmetry, symbols, and suffering. But the tools were only one part of the ordeal. The pain, according to scholars, must have been searing. There was no lidocaine, no numbing gel, just the grip of a fellow warrior's hand, a horn of mead, or the trance-like focus of those used to living close to the edge of pain and purpose. Some speculate that rituals surrounded the act, that before the carving began, the warrior would sit in silence, fasting, meditating, invoking the spirits of the land and sea. Maybe a chant filled the hut, or an old woman, the village Volva or seeress, circled the fire with herbs smoking in her hands. A sacred rhythm, guiding the body to endure and the spirit to open. And when the flint met enamel, crack. A sound not unlike a small bone breaking. One line, then another. Then the metal powder was pushed in silver dust, charcoal paste, or even colored resin made from rare stones. What was left behind was more than just a mark. It was a statement carved into the face of death, a signature of the soul that could not be undone. And when that warrior smiled across the campfire, his teeth glimmering with a line of dark iron or pale silver, The room fell quiet. That smile told a story of bravery, suffering, and initiation. That smile meant he had passed through something most dared not face. It wasn't just decoration. It was memory. There is even speculation, whispered through the corridors of anthropologists, that some of these dental marks weren't just decorative or symbolic, but communicative. Coded language in enamel, subtle variations in the number, depth, and direction of grooves might have indicated clan allegiances, personal achievements, or even marital status. A carved line across the lower incisor could whisper, "Widowed." 3 small vertical cuts might hum, "Survivor of the North Sea Storm." This wasn't just body art. This was biography, living, speaking, wordless. And unlike tattoos or runes inked on skin, teeth were eternal. They would not wrinkle or fade. Even after death, long after flesh had returned to soil and the fire of life had gone cold, the tooth grooves remained, defiant, fossilized whispers of a life once roared. Archaeologists have unearthed Viking skeletons from Sweden to Norway to Denmark, with these mysterious lines etched onto their teeth. Some grooves are so fine you'd miss them without modern light scopes. Others are bold, deep, as if the bearer wanted their story to thunder through the ages. And here lies the most haunting truth. We still don't know everything they meant. Each Viking skull that emerges from the ground seems to stare back at us through a grin of riddles. Some had lines on just one tooth. Others had patterns across several. But none have been found with identical designs. Every mouth is a cipher. Every mark, a message locked behind centuries of silence. So the next time you think of Vikings, don't just imagine horned helmets and longboats. Picture a warrior sharpening a blade with one hand, while steadying his comrade's jaw with the other. Picture the torchlight flickering across a file pressed gently to tooth enamel. 2 friends sealing a silent promise. Picture a battlefield where, before the clash of axes, warriors bared their teeth not in rage, but in remembrance. Because in the north, in that world of snow, sea, and steel, even teeth could speak.